Good morning. My name is Michael Wilkos. I'm Senior Vice President of Community Impact here at United Way of Central Ohio. I have the honor this morning of talking about my adopted city, Columbus. I grew up in Northeast Ohio and I became fascinated with this city as a kid, so much so that I took an ad out in my high school newspaper advertising Columbus and encouraging people to move here when they finished high school. I struggled with how to put 200 plus years of Columbus history into context. There's a few people that I want to thank before I get started. People like Tom Betty and Doreen Newhouse Sauer, Ed Lentz, Becky West, Doug Moats, and Jeff Lefevre, Columbus Landmarks Foundation, the Columbus Historical Society, and of course, Columbus Metropolitan Library, all of which I used to prepare a presentation for you this morning. It's not going to be as cheeky as this 150th Columbus celebration, Columbus Dispatch insert suggests about the rest of the slides, because I focused on social justice, on the nonprofit sector and philanthropy, but it's really just a bunch of anecdotes that I think are interesting, heartwarming, but also address some of the things about Columbus that most of us just don't know. Because when you ask people about Columbus history, they usually draw a blank. I love to start with this image of a movie from the early 1990s called The Applegates. It was a dark comedy. It starred Ed Begley Jr. and Stockard Channing, and it was about a family of Amazon insects. And they wanted to dismantle American global warming behaviors. In order to do that, they needed to be undetected. And so they wanted to be the most statistically average American family. So keep in mind, it's the early 1990s. Stockard Channing was a stay-at-home mom. The kids were supposed to get B's in schools, really just be undetected in their typical American suburb. And in the beginning of the movie, this family of insects is trying to figure out where could they live and be average. And Ed Begley Jr. is going through 1990 census data, and he realizes that the most statistically average city in America is Columbus, Ohio. And so this movie takes place in a fictitious suburb called Median, Ohio. And that has really been a claim to fame of Columbus for a long time. That's why we've tested a lot of products. That's why a lot of inventions started in Columbus, because if it worked in Columbus, it'll work in the rest of the United States. I think Columbus is a bit more interesting, and hopefully within the next hour, you will as well. So let's talk about the growth of our city. We are unique in the Midwest because of how much the city has grown. And I will quickly show how much over these years the city has grown geographically through annexation, which has kept our city prosperous and growing with an expanding tax base that gets us to this map of today, where Columbus is over 220 square miles. We're in 3 counties, 10 different school districts within the city of Columbus proper. And what's interesting, if you really look at this map, there's only 2 suburbs that actually touch, Upper Arlington and Grandview Heights. This has been somewhat of an unspoken policy where Columbus continues to wedge its way between all of these suburban communities in order to take its share of some of that suburban growth. Think of Tuttle Crossing, Polaris, Easton. These are all developments within the city of Columbus, which keep our tax base prosperous. But this is stuff that people don't really pay attention to, but it really does determine how well our city is being prosperous by able to take those tax resources and invest those in other neighborhoods that struggle. Well, let's get into the real history. Columbus, if you didn't know, was the first city in the nation created solely to be a state capital. It was frequent flooding that ruled out Franklinton. Lucas Sullivan, Franklinton's founder and the largest landowner in Ohio, offered a parcel on the east bank of the Scioto River. But unfortunately for Columbus's creators, these first sale of lots happened right around the start of the War of 1812, making for a less than an ideal buyer's market. There were just 18 original buyers of Columbus. By far, there was no Columbus land rush. But the design selected for Columbus was said to reflect an openness in the start of community building. If nothing else, Columbus was intended to be orderly. One of the things that you'll notice on this map, there was supposed to have been a grand park between 4th Avenue and Grant, where the commercial district would have been to the west of 4th Street, then served by this large civic green, and then grand estate homes would have gone from Grant Avenue heading to the Near East Side. which did become the wealthy area of Columbus. But everyone knows that we're named after Christopher Columbus, which I'll get to in a little more detail here in a second. But you may not know that it was actually a state legislator from Franklinton who first suggested the name because of his love of reading children's books. And he was particularly interested in what was depicted, at least at that time, a couple hundred years ago, the travels of Christopher Columbus. But the name Columbus was actually rejected by the Ohio House of Representatives. It passed the second time, not so much because people warmed up to the name Columbus, but because a lot of people didn't show up the day the vote was taken, and hence we got our name Columbus. Otherwise, we might have been referred to as, say, Ohiopolis. We are the largest city in the world named after Christopher Columbus. How many statues got erected in his honor? Well, you can see the three here. The statue to the right was moved here from Barrington, Illinois to Columbus State in 1988 when that city could no longer afford to maintain it. The statue to the far right, currently on the State House lawn, was actually at the Pontifical College at Josephinium, which was actually where Nationwide Children's Hospital is today. When they moved north of Worthington in 1932, that statue also moved to the State House. And then, of course, the statue in the middle was a gift from Genoa, Italy in 1955, where several 100,000 people showed up for its dedication. The times have changed. What we now know is that attitudes about Christopher Columbus, who did not actually land in the United States, has shifted. And two of the three statues have now been removed, the one at Columbus State and the one in front of City Hall. Currently, the Columbus Art Commission is figuring out what new representation for the city of Columbus should be in front of 90 West Broad Street. But our celebration of Christopher Columbus has actually been quite robust. Here's a picture of George Bush, who opened Ameriflora, a $95 million floral-themed exhibition in Franklin Park on the Near East Side in 1992. It was the largest celebration in the United States in conjunction with what was the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's voyage. Columbus had been a big proponent to land this celebration to kind of put Columbus on the map. But even in 1992, Native American organizations protested both this event as well as the Santa Maria, which used to be moored in downtown Columbus on the riverfront near the Broad Street Bridge. But it was really things like this. Native American mounds, similar to this one, existed throughout Central Ohio when our city was founded. That's actually how Mound Street got its name. But in the eyes of early leaders, Columbus wanted to move past these representation of Native American settlements to become more, what I will use, air quotes, modern. And getting recognized as a new capital city not only meant removing these representations of Native American culture, but it was also about building a state house. And this was the original capital structure. It was small, it lacked a lobby, and it was unsuitable for silence, deliberation, or convenience. It was reported that some of the bricks made for the original State House included human bones that were excavated from the mounds that were still dotting the Central Ohio and the downtown area landscape. The budget for these three buildings was $50,000, but it actually cost $90,000 to build, and the era of cost overruns on public projects was born. But the new capital of Columbus was actually not living up to its hype. Columbus was threatened with losing its capital distinction in the 1820s as other towns began to lobby the state legislature to move the capital for a fourth time. The arguments against Columbus were we had poor roads, high prices, and there was a shortage of hotel rooms. But fortunately, there was a national foreclosure crisis. I say fortunate for Columbus because quickly the attitudes and conversation around moving the state capital took a back seat to the foreclosure crisis. But our lack of identity and inferiority complex to other communities was established right out of the gate. In fact, Dublin tried to steal the state capital to put itself on the map. Chillicothe, which had also held the title, wanted to get it back. And of course, Zanesville, which had most recently been the state capital, was also trying to get the capital designation back to its community. And some legislatures preferred Delaware. But clearly Columbus prevailed. But from our earliest days, we really had this image problem and an inferiority complex. But Columbus was more concerned about raising revenue, and that meant taxes. So what should we tax? There were some people who wanted an alcohol tax. These sin taxes were popular at the time, but our leaders decided they ought not. Since taverns were popular with both the locals and travelers, why drive business away, many argued. And then there was a property tax, but Columbus only had 300 people, and people weren't moving here. So desperate to get more people to come to Columbus, they decided a property tax wasn't the best fit. What about a toll on the Broad Street Bridge, which originally was a covered bridge, but the bridge wasn't owned by the city. It was actually owned by Lucas Sullivan. So what was the first tax levied in Columbus? If you want to guess viewing this presentation, what you think that first tax might have been, it was actually a 50-cent annual tax on the ownership of a dog. And Columbus's challenges around leash laws and dog parks and all of these things were set in motion a long time ago. But animals is also a theme that runs deep in our community. This picture from 1898 of a circus parade marching on High Street illustrates our love of animals. As early as 1819, Columbus was known as a city that loved animals, and any animal touring show made sure to stop. Residents actually paid a quarter in 1819 to see a single elephant, reported to be the only elephant in the United States at the time. Is it any surprise that our support of the Columbus Zoo runs so deep when this has been part of our DNA for 200 years? But speaking of the building in the background, Union Station, this was actually the third train station of the 3 train stations, essentially near the intersection of Nationwide Boulevard and High. This building was representative of high-style architecture, what was referred to as the City Beautiful movement. And this was a gateway building to downtown Columbus. It was designed by famous architect Daniel Burnham, who advocated for beautiful buildings and great cities. He said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." But by the 1970s, we had really started to tire of old buildings. And in fact, Union Station was demolished. The arcade that you see there, the train station was actually underneath High Street, was getting demolished for a new convention center. Despite the fact that the train station had been placed on the National Register 2 years before, demolition started just after 5 o'clock on a Friday. And by the time the courts could open on Monday to stop demolition, the only thing that was left was a single arch. It now sits in McPherson Commons in the Arena District. And 40 years after the demolition of Union Station, a developer recreated that retail arcade that now is on a cap that sits on top of Interstate 670, connecting downtown Columbus to the short north. We loved parades, we loved animals, and we loved festivals so much that Lazarus department store used to create these models of parades marching down High Street so people could come and view their windows and shop in the store. Should it be any surprise that when Central Ohio compared itself to other similarly sized cities across the country, we ranked #1 in the number of festivals and parades in our community. But celebrations didn't pay the municipal bills, and in 1818, just a few years after we were founded, Columbus already had its first budget shortfall. That dog tax wasn't actually bringing in the revenue that people thought it was, and so what to do in the early 1800s when you run a budget deficit? Well, Columbus City Council actually printed $555.75 to pay its operating bills in 1818. I doubt these tactics are still used to ensure our AAA bond rating today. And while this number might seem quite small, the city of Columbus only had 1,200 people. So if you adjust that number for population growth and inflation, it would be as if Columbus City Council would print $9.3 million today. But it does raise the issue of how our city came together in time of need. The first, and hopefully Shannon Harden and Liz Brown aren't thinking about printing $20 bills in the basement of 90 West Broad Street, but community philanthropy started to come up on what to do when our community ran into a challenge that the public coffers just couldn't afford to fix. The first example of community philanthropy was around tree stumps, and they were everywhere. The citizens of Columbus actually scraped together $200 in community philanthropy to remove the stumps that were actually still in the middle of High Street. One local was quoted at the time as saying the town had an appearance of having emerged right out of a forest. And Columbus boosters didn't like that image. But it was really the canals that brought Columbus such early success. As the city grew around the commerce from the canals, it also needed to be governed. But the city charter at the time said that we couldn't have a city council until our population reached 700 people, which it did by the early 1820s. We had a city council of 9 managing a city of just 700 people. That would be a city council member for every 128 residents. Think about that today, where we now have a city council representative for every 128,000 residents. Speaking of forests and tree stumps, there was a forest in the city, and it was a place where trees were luckily kept intact. There was a young Lincoln Goodale. He began reading books about medicine at age 10, and at age 24, he moved to Franklinton. But in those days, doctors actually didn't do very well financially, so he opened Columbus's first pharmacy, and he prospered mightily. Even so, he'd never have become so rich, but for his faith in the future of Columbus, because of all the land that he bought, including the land where Ohio State University now sits. But in 1851, out of gratitude for this city and his riches, he dedicated 40 acres adjacent to the city's northern boundary, untouched by axe or plow, hence Columbus's first park. I think Mr. Goodale would be proud that the city's first park is still so beautifully maintained and is one of the most popular public spaces in our city. And more than a century later, Lincoln Goodale still gets in on the action as his bust wears the themed tie-dyed shirt of ComFest, which represents the openness, diversity, and inclusion Columbus continues to be known for in the Midwest. Event organizers of ComFest give him this shirt as a thank you for what he has given to us. But this theme of welcoming newcomers stretches all the way back to 1888, when 250,000 Civil War veterans descended on Columbus as the Grand Army of the Republic Convention. At that time, Columbus only had 80,000 people. Imagine having to suddenly house and feed over 3 times the total population of our city in just a few weeks. Today, it would be like having 3 million people visit Columbus for 2 weeks. And city leaders really wanted to make an impression to welcome these visitors. And arches were built over the streets to show our hospitality. When the Civil War vets left town, the citizens were convinced that the lighted arches should stay. And Columbus soon became known as Arch City, which was a symbol of welcoming newcomers to Columbus. And since then, Columbus continues to be known as a city that welcomes diversity, color, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Columbus has been a place for many years, and again, this is all relative to other cities, as a place where you can be treated with respect. Today, those arches, no longer built of wood or powered by gas, welcome locals and visitors and conventioneers just as they did 130 years ago. But what's really unique about this part of town is that it was really predicted a century ago to become what we know it is today. In the 1920s, local cartoonist Billy Ireland predicted the future of the short north in this dispatch cartoon, claiming that the area of High Street could become a village of shops, studios, coffee houses, and tea rooms run by a local colony of artists. What a wonderful place of possibilities, he claimed. He further predicted it could become the most interesting place in all of Columbus. How right he was 100 years ago. But Columbus still had an inferiority complex, and it still lacked an image. And the image often looked like this. This is actually the Soda riverfront between Broad and Town Streets, because rivers were a place of utility. They were a place where people put their trash. They were a place of open sewers. And most businesses along the river were either low-income housing or factory and industrial sites. And Billy Ireland, as well as many others, didn't like this image of Columbus. So he did yet another cartoon, this one also from 1920, encourages voters to support the construction of what was referred to as Victory Park, so that we can leave a favorable impression of our city upon the thousands of strangers who travel the national road. It is more than worthwhile to keep our self-respect. Well, the riverfront did get a lot better after 1920. Some of that was because of the flood, but it really wasn't for another 90 years when the Soda Mile opened, to much applause, that the Columbus riverfront finally started to shine. We now have an enjoyable way to experience our riverfront. one of America's largest cities, by the way, that is not on a navigable waterway. Finally, that city beautiful movement started by that famed architect Daniel Burnham in the 1908 plan became realized. And we will continue to improve our community by having one of the most spectacular riverfronts in the country. What's been interesting for me personally during quarantine, on nice days, I ride my bike down to Souda Mile, and it's impressive to see the number of people just enjoying what the riverfront now has to offer. Well, let's return to that inferiority complex. Here again is a 1911 Dispatch cartoon that shows Mr. Columbus really needs a makeover, or maybe a visit from the TV show What Not to Wear, right? And while Mr. Landscape Architect to the right is designing him a new suit, the man to the left is showing off the latest styles of municipal clothing. Mr. Columbus is dreaming of the day where he could look as chic as Cleveland, Baltimore, or even Detroit. Fast forward 67 years later, and here we have a 1978 Columbus Monthly cover posing the same question about that inferiority complex. But this time the models have a lot less clothes on, and the cities that we feel inferior to have changed. Long gone is our inferiority to industrial nearby cities. In this image, we feel inferior to Houston, Atlanta, and Denver. And my question is, are we still feeling inferior to other cities? Is it now Charlotte and Austin? We do have a lot of accomplishments in our city and a lot of history to ground us. So let's keep going with that. Here's a corner of Broad and High, which was the birth of Huntington Bank. But at the time it was known as the P.W. Huntington and Company Bank, and it opened for business in 1866 at the corner of Broad and High. The 4-story building that you see on the corner with the turret was the home of Huntington Bank, and 160 years later, Huntington Bank still operates on that corner. It was said on many mornings that Petalia Huntington, the founder, picked up small sticks on the way to work to put into the stove to heat his office, but many people think that this may have only been an illustration of his thrifty nature. He was also the son of a banker, and he was a descendant of an original signer of the US Constitution. He went from being a messenger of the bank to being on the board of directors. And Huntington continues to be one of the largest banks in our region, and of course, the distributor of some of the best free pens in the community. Moving on to Memorial Hall on Broad Street. There was a large celebration to dedicate this building in 1906. At the time, it was the nation's second largest auditorium in seating capacity. It was built to honor Civil War veterans, but it took so long in coming that it also honored the veterans of the Spanish-American War. But after Veterans Memorial was built in the 1950s over on West Broad Street at the river, this building struggled to find a home. It then became COSI, which also moved to West Broad Street on the other side of the river, and today it houses offices for Franklin County. The City Hall we know today was not our original City Hall. This City Hall, prior to 1921, was located on East State Street across from the State House, where the Ohio Theater now sits. The building was referred to as a monstrosity of Victorian architecture by those who hated what was called bric-a-brac or did not appreciate the building's rather odd architecture. But there was a spectacular fire, and City Hall then was forced to relocate to a more prominent site now at Broad, the new Souda Mile project. It was actually the Columbus Dispatch, which was a huge supporter of those annexation maps that I showed in the beginning of the presentation. In doing so, the Columbus Dispatch believed the growth of the city would increase the power of the newspaper's influence on the public agenda. They wanted a larger city. They were setting in motion a policy of annexation that took several decades later when Mayor Sensenbrenner really took that to new levels, creating our current city of more than 220 square miles. Maybe Columbus's most iconic skyscraper, it was originally called the American Union Citadel, American Insurance Union Citadel. Now we refer to as the Leveck Tower. It was the tallest building between New York and Chicago at the time of its opening in the 1920s. And in this picture in 1926, it shows how significantly out of scale the tower was compared to the rest of the city. The building really put Columbus on the map as an emerging Midwestern city. But the building is 555 feet and 5 inches tall. Those additional 5 inches were specifically added to make this building 5 inches taller than the Washington Monument, which gave the building's owners a marketable cachet for leasing office space. Another iconic downtown building was built by Daniel Samuel Hartman, once the richest man in Columbus, and he derived his fortune from a cure-all tonic called Peruna. There's actually a hyphen in there, which is why I accentuated the word. And he claimed that he received the formula in a dream from a Native American. And Peruna was the most successful selling patent medicine in the world in 1887. But sales began to fall after the Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced the good doctor to disclose his product's ingredients, which was essentially pure alcohol. This building at Rich and Third was demolished in the 1970s. And by the time his empire was collapsing, Dr. Hartman had an office building, an acoustically perfect theater, 2 hotels, a surgical hospital, a palatial home on East Town Street that was clad in marble to display his wealth. And for all he owned, nothing remains but the Hartman Hotel at the corner of 4th and Main, now a condominium building. Construction of other buildings, such as the State House that we now know, had been in the works since 1837, and it was built to replace those other smaller buildings that were on the opposite corner of State and High. The work of the State House had start and stops in fits of appropriations, and generations of Columbus citizens grew up looking at a tall and ugly boarded up fence, and it was built to keep the construction workers in, which were actually inmates from the Ohio Penitentiary from escaping. For those who didn't think that we needed such a large State House, somewhat of a miracle occurred for those proponents. In February of 1852, just as people were arguing that Ohio really needed a small building just to store records, those old small State House buildings burned to the ground. And it finally provided the impetus for the House and Senate to finally approve the rest of the funds to allow the State House to be finished. The building took 24 years to complete. This is the Ohio State Armory and Gymnasium. It was destroyed by an intense fire in 1958. This castle-like building had been the logical conclusion to Ohio State's problem. In the 1890s, student groups formed their own athletic associations, and they were constantly overspending. Rather than someday being embarrassed by this scandal of overspending, the university founded an athletic association and built the Armory. Finally, students had a place for physical and military training, as was expected from a land-grant institution. But the site stood empty for more than 25 years after the building burned until construction in 1989 of the Wexner Center for the Arts. Some of those brick design elements of the Wexner Center, designed by Richard Trott and Peter Eisenman, are actually paying homage to this original building that sat on the site. Let's move on to women's suffrage. Famous English suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst came to the city to speak in favor of women's suffrage in 1911 and spoke at that second largest auditorium in the country at the time when it was built, Memorial Hall on East Broad Street. Many well-known and educated women of the city believed voting was intended to be 1 vote per family, and as the moral compass of each family, unsullied by the dirt of the political arena, the woman would be looked to by her husband for moral guidance in his selection at the polls. After seeking her view, the man would vote his wife's advice. This was the thinking that she communicated. Mrs. John Battelle, who ran her family just as forcefully as she set the course for the Battelle Memorial Institute to honor her husband and son, was not buying into that. And she was not kidding herself that a husband would listen to the opinion of his wife. She clearly supported women's suffrage. And women's suffrage, that is, suffrage for white women, came to Columbus a few years before it did in the rest of the United States. But the Dispatch also endorsed the movement, as well as Columbus City Council, which adopted a resolution granting women the right to vote in elections in 1917. This is a Columbus Dispatch cartoon endorsing the right to vote. I will quote its editorial opinion. It is an outrage to deny women equal rights with men while we make them carry men's burdens. When their husbands are dead or are drunkards or are in jail, the women support the children and do it bravely and efficiently. They pay taxes for the support of a government in which they have no voice. Look over the graduating class in the nearest high school and see if there are not 2 girls there for every boy. The dispatch endorsement, as well as Columbus City Council and the movement of powerful women at the time, passed that vote. And by the way, I think there's another election coming up, so this is my opportunity to plug. Please show up and vote. Another leader in our community, and Columbus's one of his best known citizens, was actually dying of pneumonia by 1907, but it was Rev James Poindexter. Born in Virginia, he came to Columbus at the age of 19. He was a barber and a pastor at Second Baptist Church for 55 years, and he was well known to the public and politicians of his day, serving as a member of the Columbus School Board and as a Columbus City Councilman. He was a trustee for the State School of the Blind, a trustee at Wilberforce University, and an advocate for African American interests for President Hayes, President McKinley, and Governor Dennison. And he was believed to be the only African American who by 1907 had ever served on a jury in Ohio. His abhorrence of slavery and desire for social justice is well known and actually moved Columbus further ahead of the United States with its attitudes around racial justice. It was Poindexter Village, one of the first public housing projects in the United States, was dedicated in his memory in 1940. President Franklin Roosevelt came to Columbus to do the honors. This now obsolete project has been redeveloped by Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority and now is a mixed income community, as we have recognized that projects like this don't always work out the way they were intended. However, one of the original buildings at Poindexter is being preserved to honor the legacy of this project and the memory of James Poindexter. Another influential person in Columbus's history was Columbus folk artist, barber, teller of biblical tales carved in wood, and mentor to the next generation of artists, Elisha Pierce. He received national attention and worldwide attention when New York City's Museum of Modern Art featured his wood carvings. His barbershop, unfortunately, was dismantled when Columbus State needed to build a large parking garage. But as you drive down Long Street from downtown to the Near East Side, there is a statue of Pierce that marks where the barbershop once stood. For those of you that have been in town for a little while, you remember Big Bear. Here's the first Big Bear in 1935. It was the first grocery self-service supermarket, and it was in a former roller rink on Lane Avenue, now the site of Riverwatch Tower. The elliptical structure prior to being the roller rink had been the Crystal Slipper nightclub and was once used as a stable for polo ponies. But for a short time, Big Bear actually kept a live bear in a cage outside the door to attract shoppers and children. But the real show was actually always inside. Because it had been that former roller rink with a slightly banked floor, the dance of shopping carts was a major attraction. Left unattended, even for a moment, hundreds of shopping carts would turn into a demolition derby of sorts, especially on busy Saturday mornings, as those carts would just roll away from you if you left them unattended. Moving on to Central High School, now COSI, there were events in February of 1971 that actually led to a major US Supreme Court decision. From January through March of 1971, there was wide social unrest in many American high schools, including Columbus City schools, high schools and junior high schools. Protests around the Vietnam War, around civil rights and social justice, and 10 students at Marion Franklin High School were suspended for 10 days each for what was called disobedient conduct following assembly. As per district policy at the time, an expulsion from school required a hearing. The suspension did not. A few weeks before civil rights protests by African American students began at Central High School, the administration canceled a student-organized Black History Week assembly when it did not agree with the students' choice of speakers. The next day, there were widespread demonstrations at many Columbus schools, and 2 students were suspended. Neither had a hearing. On the basis of a violation of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in favor of the students. The Due Process Clause forbade arbitrary deprivation of liberty. And this case is a landmark decision on student rights. But the city's oldest charity, continuing to this day, was founded in 1838 following a cholera outbreak. The Female Benevolent Society was established to, quote, alleviate the distress of the poor and afflicted of their own sex. 33 years later, in 1871, almost on the same date, the society adopted a new constitution at First Presbyterian Church, still located downtown, and they emphasized, quote, to seek the poor in the city of Columbus and provide them relief, aid, instruction, employment, as many deemed best suited. And seek they did, as the ladies of the Female Benevolent Society, all upper-class women of the finest Columbus families at the time, made home visits and personal meetings a key element to the charity's operation to help break the cycle of poverty for some of Columbus's most struggling citizens. In 1920, the new name of a hospital operated by Dr. Method and Tribbitt was announced, called the Alpha Hospital. The committee met at the YMCA, and after careful review of the name suggested by several competitors for the prize, Mr. Charles Chavis's suggestion was selected. The name was most appropriate with Alpha, meaning first. The hospital was the first African-American hospital in Columbus. Though African-American physicians could work in other hospitals, they were not permitted to work on an equal basis with white doctors, which is why this hospital was created. Continuing this theme around racial justice, it was in 1933 at The Ohio State University, all seniors in home economics were required to live in what was called the Home Management House on a street in the University District for a period of 5 weeks, during which they would put into practice all facets of management theories, during which time the students would buy, cook, and eat meals together. However, in the spring of 1932, an African-American student, Doris Weaver, was told she could not substitute another course for this last requirement, or that she could move into a well-furnished modern apartment of, quote, similar, unquote, quality and quantity of furnishings to the house that the other home ec students were living in. Ohio State University President George Rittmeyer and the OSU Board of Trustees said at the time, quote, it has never been the policy of Ohio State University to require students of different races or nationalities to reside together as part of a single family. It is not within the power to compel the people of one nationality or race to room with or live with such an intimate relation against their desires. Clearly, attitudes have shifted in our community and in the university's decision. It was at 9 a.m. in 1913, Columbus's greatest disaster began when frozen ground and unprecedented rain combined. Earthen levees broke, sending 30 feet of water into Franklinton and West Side Columbus neighborhoods. Houses were knocked off their foundations and 93 lives were lost. The river flooded 11 times before 1913. Nobody was prepared for this 100-year event. The east side of Columbus was never in danger, where downtown Columbus is. Those 3 tall buildings you see here are the intersection of Broad and High. But residents did panic when someone at the Neal House Hotel yelled, "The dam has busted." James Thurber's short story called "The Day the Dam Broke" was written 20 years after the tragedy, and he estimated it would have taken a rise of 95 feet of water to actually flood High Street on the east side of the river. However, this rumor that the east side had flooded grew more frantic, and someone yelled, "Go east." The crowd included housewives, dogs, cats, his own mother, James Thurber's own mother, carrying eggs and bread, office workers, children on skates, and a driver who drove all the way to Reynoldsburg to escape the flood. Clearly, they were not in danger on the east side of the river. Looking at these buildings at Broad and High, one in particular, the Wyandotte building, is of specific noteworthy to Columbus's architectural history. Secretively, Columbus has periodically suffered from what many refer to as Cleveland envy. This building, built in 1898, allowed Columbus to be a little smug. Not only did our first skyscraper, you only need to have 12 stories, by the way, to officially be a skyscraper. Not only was it our first skyscraper, but when it opened, Columbus also had snagged the famous architect yet again, Daniel Burnham, who had designed Cleveland's Society for Savings Bank to do the honor for a similarly architecturally significant building in Columbus. And to make smugness even more smuggier, Burnham also designed Columbus's third Union Station, which we talked about earlier. And fortunately, this building has survived now for a century. Another iconic Columbus building is our main library on Grant Street. It was dedicated in 1907 and made possible by a gift of $200,000 by Andrew Carnegie. Columbus was one of the last Carnegie-funded libraries in the country, and it's popularly believed that Carnegie was moved to fund this library after meeting with someone named John Pugh, a Columbus librarian, after they together pored over maps of Columbus and its growing population and demographic changes. Carnegie had agreed to fund a brick library. And though Pugh delightedly reported back to city officials about this commitment to build a library, they asked Mr. Pugh to return to Carnegie and ask for a marble library. Instead of labeling Columbus as ingrates, Carnegie was said to be pleased with this request as it showed the importance that Columbus was putting on learning in our city. The library site was actually on a former swamp known as Frog Heaven, and for all the noise of counting frogs in the spring, by 1907, that now swamp became a popular courting spot for young human lovers, not the frog kind. Moving to World War I, there was a lot of Columbus backlash to German residents during World War I. German textbooks were symbolically burned at Broad High in protest of the foreign policy actions of Kaiser Wilhelm. German ceased to be used in Columbus public and parochial schools. 14,000 students who were studying the language stopped learning their German grammar and verb agreements. Since the late 19th century, 4 schools in Columbus had taught all subjects exclusively in German, and the Ohio legislature published all Ohio proceedings in English and German versions. The book burning was really just political theater, like renaming Frankfurters as hot dogs or sauerkraut as Liberty cabbage. But most of Columbus had German roots. A third of our city was German in the late 1800s. City council did its own political theater, however, changing some street names and place names, like Schiller Park became Washington Park, Whittier Street for Schiller Street, thereby trading in one poet's name for another. But most of city council was also German. But by the 1920s, Schiller Park had resumed its original name and schools were yet again teaching German, but this time it was an elective. Speaking of parks in our city, this is a picture of Goodwill Park. It actually was converted into Camp Jackson, a Civil War training camp for Union volunteers in 1861. Not quite the image we see of Comfest today, and Mr. Goodwill, who had dedicated the land to use this park, was most likely not amused. 2 months later, Camp Chase was opened 4 miles west of the State House, and Goodwill Park was able to return to its forest in the city, its original plan. In 1929, a gift from Mary Griswold, the YMCA was able to build the building we now know on South 4th Street near the PNC Tower. But since its inception in 1886, the YWCA worked to empower women and eliminate racism. It has housed young women when needed, provided for emancipated teens not yet ready to go out into the world alone, and it housed relocated Japanese women in 1945, signed charters and petitions to support anti-racism, and supported the ERA amendment in Ohio. We are delighted that Mary Griswold's gift still allows us to have a gorgeous YWCA in downtown Columbus. But not all of our curious buildings have been saved. Columbus was not a union town because of the abundance of free labor from prisoners at this complex, the Ohio State Penitentiary, now the site of the Arena District. Employers often looked for such cheap labor. In only one of many examples, a new glove and mitten factory opened by the Halleck Company in 1899 right outside the prison walls. The operation employed 60 women and children with the other necessary labor from the factory it owned inside the prison. It produced tens of thousands of pairs of gloves every day. The leather was done by women and children outside the plant, and men did the other production inside. Within a few years, however, Halleck's practices were challenged, not by labor unions, but by another company that wanted a sweetheart deal for its industry. Prison labor was a politically plum with the prerogative of the governor, and the controversy over for-profit companies using free prison labor continues as a social justice issue 100 years later. Go back to Ohio State. The first meeting of the Ohio Agricultural Mechanical College was held in the office of Governor Rutherford Hayes in 1870, and the stage was set for the future Ohio State University with the establishment of a Land Grant Act signed by President Lincoln in 1862. And after looking at many sites for the location of the new college, the trustees finalized their decision to buy Mr. Neal's 331-acre farm for $118,000, based supposedly on the sweet artesian spring waters of Mirror Lake. After tasting the water, one German trustee exclaimed, quote, "It's hard to get a Dutchman away from a spring like that." And Columbus residents would come from miles to bring water home from Mirror Lake. But it was in 1931 when the OSU graduating classes of 1927, 29, and 1930 announced plans to convert Mirror Lake's old spring into artistic rock garden. The spring, which supplied that fresh water, was considered a major factor, again, in that decision to build Ohio State where it is. However, in the 1890s, the city of Columbus had punctured the source of that spring water, and within a few days, Mirror Lake had gone dry. The lake has now been supplied with a small fountain to keep water constantly moving. You still see that water movement in the redesigned Mirror Lake of today. It's no longer spring water, so please don't go to Mirror Lake and try to take some water home for drinking. The response to racism in Columbus has included both organized and unorganized protests over the years. This is a postcard of Bud Dairy that you see on North 4th Street in Italian Village, just opening now as a new Cameron Mitchell themed food hall. But Bud Dairy actually advertised its new dairy-based soft drink in the Ohio edition of the KKK's newspaper, The Fiery Cross. The Klan was planning a major convention at the Ohio Fairgrounds, and the Bud family spotted an opportunity to increase its market share. However, Italian Village and Wineland Park were mixed-race neighborhoods. And the day after that advertisement was published, African Americans started to cancel their milk orders en masse. The Bud Dairy family tried to defend themselves that they were in fact not racist. This fell on deaf ears. And after 7 months, the Bud Dairy family was forced to sell. This action is thought to be one of the earliest successful racially based economic boycotts in the United States. And then there's busing. Busing came to Columbus in the late 1970s, and the buses rolled without incident. There was no obstruction, no angry protest, few parents kept their kids home as planned, but the impact of that decision has been far-reaching. In the early 1970s, enrollment in Columbus schools peaked at 110,000. Now, just 50,000 are in the district. And this decision around busing across the country resulted in an explosion of suburban growth starting in the 1980s. But since the city of Columbus's annexation policies stretch into 10 school districts, the city continues to maintain its middle-class tax base, unlike any other Midwestern city, even if those middle-class neighborhoods are not located in the city of Columbus School District. Here we have one of the original pictures of the Franklin Park Conservatory. Originally part of the 1893 Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, the building was disassembled and brought to Columbus to be part of Franklin Park. But it was not Franklin Park just yet. It was the Ohio State Fairgrounds. And is one of the few buildings that remain from the 1893 exhibition, which was also known as the White City, for its beautiful, although temporary, grand white buildings, one of the few buildings that remain. Here's a picture of Great Western Shopping Center. In order for the Don Casto organization, which also built Town and Country, to attract people to go as far west as Hague Avenue, they built the Walk of Wonders, a small scale, amazingly detailed list of the 7 wonders. It included a 20-foot model of the Eiffel Tower, still rumored to be in the backyard of someone's home. It also had Niagara Falls with running water, the Grand Canyon without making it look like a giant pothole. In addition to these wonders were the Taj Mahal, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Fountain of Trevi, the Parthenon of Athens, and the Sphinx and Great Pyramids of Egypt. While it drew shoppers destined for the ages, A maintenance man found that the Niagara Falls exhibit suffered an erosion problem that carried off some of the buildings from some of the other exhibits, and it was time to take the exhibit down. Sadly, it now exists in only postcards and memories. Moving on to transportation. A new downtown plan turned our 3rd Street and 4th Streets into one-way paired arterial streets north of downtown in 1950. And though President Eisenhower signed the National Highway Act in 1954, the interstate highway plans had not been fully emerged in our city. When they did, their purpose was to facilitate the rapid escape of city dwellers in case of atomic war during the Cold War. The changes to 3rd and 4th Streets were also motivated by war, but not the Cold War, World War II. Because for more than a decade, Columbus was not investing in its infrastructure in order to invest those dollars in the war effort. However, the conversion of 3rd and 4th, here you see 3rd Street heading into downtown Columbus, was also done as a way to ease traffic. That lasted a matter of weeks. And this is a condition that we still suffer on our daily commutes into downtown Columbus. Another Columbus icon, White Castle. This is 1934. A customer could go to many locations to enjoy White Castle in our city, but before they could enjoy a burger, employees had to read a 16-page manual. There were 31 points on how to dress, 19 points on how to treat a hamburger, 12 points about the bun, and more on flours, onions, coffee, pickles, and even about salt and pepper. Columbus has been home to White Castle for almost a century, and the company was one of the first fast food pioneers, priding itself on quality, affordability, and especially cleanliness, which is why the Ingram family chose to build their buildings with white enamel panels to represent the cleanliness of what you would experience inside. Excited residents poured into Columbus's downtown intersection of Broad and High in 1945 to celebrate the end of World War II. This was in contrast to the celebration that marked the end of World War I, when thousands of people crowded also to Broad and High, but they showed up days early because of rumors that peace had come to our country 3 days sooner than what it originally did. But on August 14th, 1945, people arrived en masse on the right day to celebrate the end of World War II. Another publication looking at 1980 Columbus Monthly's lead story called Cops Under Fire, a 21-page expose about white Columbus police officers shooting and killing unarmed Black youth. A Black Columbus police officer who spoke about this needed protection for his family because of fear of retaliation from other police officers who didn't believe that breaking the pact of commitment to the police force was the way to go. But this article also referenced a previous report by the Columbus Bar Association that said, and I quote, "There's a psychology within the department that tries to create fear in the minds of lowly and defenseless citizens. It goes further to state a pattern of physical abuse occurs when officers are trying to subdue certain people." That report was published in 1949. And again, its authors were the Columbus Bar Association. And a year after Stonewall Union of Columbus was founded, the city held its first Gay Pride Parade in 1982. With over 1,000 people participating in the march on High Street, the parade marked the 13th anniversary of the police raid on Stonewall Union in New York City's Greenwich Village. And many point to that raid as the galvanizing moment for the gay rights movement. Marchers in Columbus's first Pride Parade in June of 1982 were headed south on Front Street to the Nationwide Complex, and organized by Stonewall Columbus, there were just 500 people marching in this first event. And since the official parade, Columbus is now reported to have one of the largest celebrations in the United States. One street where we would not encourage parades would be Interstate 270. But the highway that you now know was not one of its original aligned routes. In 1953, the idea for Interstate 270 was created. Here you can see different versions. The one that was the most popular actually put the northern arc of 270 just south of the city of Worthington, essentially through where Morse Road is today, because Columbus was a very small community at the time. By the time Interstate 270 opened, After 13 years of construction, that last link of Interstate 270 opened, making it possible to skirt Columbus completely by 1975. Many Columbus residents who lived within the heart of the city with no thought as to how much gas would be used to travel the 40-mile distance around 270 got in their cars to drive the entirely new experience and see what the suburbs and exit ramps actually look like. This is actually Route 23 at 270 in Worthington. When it opened, many people joked that Interstate 270 was the road to nowhere. But the most ambitious building project to be built in Columbus was announced in 1953. It was the Temple of Goodwill, designed to be much taller than the Leveck Tower and serve as the headquarters for all the Protestant denominations in the United States. The site was purchased to cover 2 city blocks facing the Scioto River between Long and Spring Streets. Construction would start for a hotel, broadcast facilities, office space for 5,000 workers, and parking as soon as the money could be raised to build the tower. However, by 1968, the plan still had not materialized, and the Ohio Council of Churches voted against making Columbus its headquarters. The tower, one of many never built in Columbus, did become the new home of American Electric Power, which moved to Columbus from New York City in 1982. And here we have Lazarus Department Store. The Lazarus family gave Columbus the most amazing department store emporium for over 100 years. The no-hassle, one-price deals, singing canaries in every department in 1909, a ladies' room and a place to lay down with an attendant on duty, because shopping is also very tiring, and a return policy that included taking back things that had never even been purchased in a Lazarus store. And of course, for those of you that have been in Columbus a long time, remember the wonderful celery dressing. But most astonishing is that the store actually fixed the floating date of Thanksgiving. And though Thanksgiving was a holiday since Lincoln's time, the last Thursday in November was sometimes a 4th Thursday, and sometimes it was a 5th Thursday. If the date were fixed to the 4th Thursday, Fred Lazarus reasoned that customers would not be cheated out of shopping days before Christmas. So he lobbied President Roosevelt, and Lazarus single-handedly stabilized the Thanksgiving date in 1941. However, it was not without cost. The first year of the new national holiday was a nightmare on train tables and for football games, including the Ohio State-Michigan game. But Black Friday was born in Columbus, and I'm sure that the Black Friday of 2020 will be the first significant change in behavior in the more than 60 years we have been celebrating this unofficial holiday. So let's close with a Halloween story. Columbus was actually afraid of Halloween in 1902, and it had every right to be. Hordes of children, mostly small boys like this one you see in Franklinton, notice the State House Rotunda way in the background, were preparing for their annual revenge as the sun would go down. Asking for candy was not yet a Columbus Halloween custom, but mischief bordering on vandalism was. Halloween in Columbus was a 3-day mischief-a-thon. The first night was devoted to tic-tacs, which were small spools of string wound around a nail and fixed to window panes, and when the wind would unravel them, occupants might be frightened to think there was a burglar. A quicker and more gratifying variation was to steal a handful of corn from a grocer's barrels and throw them against a window. The second night was called Cabbage Night, where the hard cores of cabbages were jammed against doors to prevent inhabitants from getting out of their houses. And then the third night was Gate Night, where wrought iron gates were removed from their hinges and either tossed into trees or carried a distance from their original location. At the worst, they were placed on tracks in the hopes of derailing streetcars. The annual Council of War at the Columbus Board of Education met the day before Halloween, knowing that the 17,500 or more school-aged children might seek revenge against their most despised targets. Janitors were asked to stay the night in their school buildings until dawn. And meanwhile, many farmers on the outskirts of Columbus planned to sit up all night in their fields with muskets loaded with rock salt. Fortunately for us, now it's a night of trick or treat, which is walking around in your favorite costume, seeking sweet treats. We have much to be proud of in our city, and we have much to learn from the past. Columbus is a unique city, despite its claim to fame depicted in the movie The Applegates. I'm proud that Columbus is my new home, and I think if we know our history, we know where we're going. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you learned something about America's 14th largest city. Thank you.